This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All, where this week I'm speaking with Karen Hall, Programme Director of Ecological Education at the Institute for Applied Ecology, about an inspiring initiative that connects conservation with social rehabilitation. We explore what ecological education involves, the features of the landscape and ecology of the region where Karen works, and how changes to funding have affected these conservation efforts.
I'm an Air Force brat that was raised in the mountains of North Carolina after my dad was in the war. And I continued to live there up and through college. And when I finally finished my degrees up late in life, I actually had studied ethnobotany, which was really close to my beginnings because I grew up in a place where cultures and knowledge kind of collided. And so being able to study ethnobotany was a really wonderful way to see one place where I lived, but the many different sets of knowledge that go into how you make a living in a particular area. So it was a really wonderful place for me to grow up in North Carolina.
Yeah, so who was having an input into that knowledge? Were there different groups of people?
Yeah, so obviously the settlers, the Scotch-Irish settlers who came into the area and then continued to live there, and their knowledge bases. And then, of course, the original people, the Cherokee people, and that's the tribe that I did my dissertation work with. Really amazing knowledge base of the materials there, the plants there. They wouldn't consider them materials; they'd consider them just a part of the life. And really other people too. So there was a strong component of what I would call outsiders coming in, influencing the area. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because as you know, people from outside an area can have a very positive influence actually on the people that they're outside to. So that area has experienced a lot of that. And as a result of that, you get a really rich and interesting mix of people in the area, although most often Appalachia is colored as one. I don't really believe that's true.
And how did you take that forward in your work? What did you end up doing?
I studied with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. They are in their original homeland. Their land is roughly 10 miles where I grew up, but honestly, the land I grew up on was theirs originally. And I studied particularly with elders and looking at the way in which elders used plants as medicine, that knowledge base, and also how to continue that knowledge into the next generation was a point of big interest to me. It's fortunate that that knowledge is continuing and has continued over the years, so it's still intact.
I gather you now work for the Institute for Applied Ecology, and it looks like you have now developed your learning into an educational role. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I think really at my core, I've always been an educator, and maybe it took me some years to recognize that. And also coming from the area where I grew up, there was a lot of poverty. Therefore, also what goes along with poverty often, which is a lack of education. And so for me, stepping into that role was just a natural thing. And so with the Institute for Applied Ecology in 2021, I took over the role of the program director for the Ecological Education Department. And at that time, we were working in prisons. We were working with children. We were working with juvenile detention facilities, youth. And I really thought it was a terrific program. And so I took the reins and we continued to grow that effort.
And is that institutions across the state or was that across the US?
The Institute for Applied Ecology is a nonprofit. And so we actually have two locations, one in Corvallis, Oregon, and the other in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we work really throughout the American West. So our work in prisons spanned 9, 10 prisons and 4 or 5 states.
So a very big project. And within that, I gather you had funding for some ecological work around the site. Am I right in thinking it's the sites around where the prisons are based?
Yes, we have relationships with the Bureau of Land Management, which a U.S. federal agency, and the prisons most often are located within sagebrush steppe habitat. And we would work with the BLM agents, and the BLM agents would tell us which sagebrush plants they wanted us to grow or what other plants they wanted us to grow. We would grow them, and then they would go out in the areas that are around the prison. Now, not directly around the prison, but generally. We have a big giant map that shows the many plants we've put out over the years. We've grown over 3.8 million sagebrush plants in the time since the program began in 2014.
Okay, and can you just explain what the BLM agents are?
Yeah, so the Department of Interior is one of the big key agencies in the U.S. government, and Bureau of Land Management is one of them. And in the American West, BLM actually owns a lot of land. So they manage land on behalf of the public. And you might wonder, well, why are they managing all of this land for the public? And really, it is for range. It is for any other natural resources that might be utilized by the public. And so, it's seen as a common good, essentially. And so BLM's task is to manage that landscape. And they've most recently been concerned with restoration because there is a decline in sagebrush steppe habitat due to, human pressure. Some of that pressure is natural because it does come from fire. But the reason the fires are able to spread is because humans have introduced invasive plants that are highly flammable. And so BLM restores that land in order to make sure that it's still healthy and still functioning as an ecosystem.
And that land, the sort of end goal for it, is that to be used for recreation purposes, or is it more of it's managed for people, but it's also managed for conservation for other species?
It is a multi-purpose use. So rangelands in the West are often used for, grazing cattle, but also recreation and also, frankly, for functioning ecosystems. And what BLM recognized is the need for all of this restoration of these lands that are impacted so negatively. And so what they began doing is putting together seed sources to try to restore the land because there is not a market in native seeds. There are plenty of markets for seeds for things like food crops, but not for native plants that are in sagebrush steppe habitat or, gosh, most other habitats in the U.S. And so BLM really started putting its effort toward getting seeds and also, in our case, plugs to directly be able to benefit restoration.
And how much of a land area are we talking about here?
Well, sagebrush steppe habitat encompasses about 10 states, I would say, in the American West. I can't put a finger on the number of acres. I'd have to look that up for you, but it's an enormous landmass. Normally, it occurs in areas of the West called the high desert area, but its span is amazing. So I would say it goes all the way from Canada down into New Mexico.
Wow, so a really big, huge amount of land.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming kind of historically this land just wasn't managed maybe correctly, or perhaps it was overlooked and that's why these problems developed. Is that fair to say?
I think it is. I think it's a confluence of, being used by people coming into the area and overgrazing, and then planting plants that were fast growing in order to feed the cattle that then escaped, that then became a problem. And then wildfire continued to exacerbate that problem. And also people moving into the West, really, and disturbing habitat that way. It's, I suppose, a kind of a perfect storm of human problems that are exacerbated by climate change. I would say that's probably the biggest piece.
Am I right as well in saying, so this is public owned land? Is it also public access land? Can anyone get onto it?
More or less, that's true. Yeah, there are some lands where the public doesn't necessarily have access to, but yeah, it is public lands, but it's also private lands. There's quite a number of really, really large ranches in the American West that are privately owned. And while BLM does work some with private landowners, there are other federal agencies that also work with private landowners. And we actually have contracted with other nonprofit groups that work with private landowners for some of the sagebrush.
And in terms of the habitat itself, I'm guessing it's got a very specific biodiversity attached to it. And, can you maybe talk about the plants and the animals that might call it home?
Sure. Probably the most iconic really is the greater sage grouse. And there are a few species of sage grouse. A greater sage grouse has probably the widest distribution. And it's a bird that's a little chicken-shaped. I can tell you that. And it has an amazing mating dance where the chest of this bird blows out really large and it fluffs its wings really rapidly in an attempt to attract mates. It organizes around a set of sagebrush steppe that people call leks, L-E-K. And a lek is simply a breeding area where many males of this greater sage-grouse gather along with the females to mate. And then the species proliferates. So sagebrush, the plant itself, is really the keystone plant of the particular habitat. And around that plant, over 350 species depend on it for life. It's very unusual because it has a very long set of roots and it can mine the very deep layers of soil for water. And it brings that water up to the surface for other plants, in addition to bringing it up for itself, of course. It provides shade, it provides food, is a part of the greater sage grouse's whole life cycle, from dependence by the chicks on it, as the parents are foraging and the chicks are foraging for bugs that are around the sagebrush plant. But also there are many, many other animals that are dependent on that particular species.
I guess there's a cultural element. I was thinking when you were talking about the proliferation of fires and things like that, obviously this habitat provides ecosystem services, but it's much deeper than that, isn't it? It's not just about, oh, these things happen and they inconvenience us. It's about, this is a legacy landscape that has cultural significance to the people who, originally were on it. How much have they been involved in the conservation of it? Or I suppose at the mercy of all the actions that have been brought down on this habitat and have caused it to diminish? I mean, it's important to put them forefront, really.
Well, as you know, there are tribes really that extend the extent of sagebrush steppe habitat. And those tribes have been historically and currently involved in the restoration of sagebrush steppe habitat as well. We've worked particularly with BLM agents who are also Native Americans who are interested in restoring sagebrush. So I think it's very important to their tribes because they recognize also that without sagebrush, you don't have the habitat functioning. And so that's kind of step one as to get the habitat functioning and moving for people. Obviously, they are dependent on that habitat for food originally. Of course, not so much contemporarily, but historically they were. And so making that sagebrush steppe continue to function is first and foremost, I think, in their minds still. And partly that's for philosophical reasons and cultural reasons because they recognize at least that a functioning habitat provides life overall. And so that is not necessarily an ethic that white settler Americans like myself have. And so it's nice to see the tribes really embed that philosophy in the work that they do with ecosystems. And I'm hoping that the US will move toward a wider land ethic and a better land ethic similar to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sometimes we bump up against the fact that perhaps, like you say, those land ethics, they don't become apparent until things have got to quite a dire situation. And they also bump up against the fact that we're always trying to go head to head with anything that's economically beneficial. So, if it means investing in conservation to mitigate long-term effects versus not investing in conservation and making money out of the land in the short term, I think that's always an issue that we face. And I'm guessing that with these kinds of programs, there is quite a bit of funding involved. Where does the funding for this normally come from?
Yeah, so it does come from federal agencies largely. Some private foundations jump in the game as well, but mostly it is federally and state-backed. State governments and their particular arms also are involved in it. Our funding has primarily come from the Bureau of Land Management for many years, but as I mentioned before, we have worked with some other nonprofits to fund smaller portions of the project. So I just wanted to mention, because I realized I completely glossed over the one cultural aspect of sagebrush that your viewers can perhaps see, and that's through American Westerns. Westerns do a good job, Hollywood Westerns do a good job of depicting sagebrush steppe habitat and cowboys throughout the American West, and your viewers might have a perspective of cowboys riding through the range, and that range being sagebrush steppe habitat.
Yes, I'm sure a lot of people will immediately get that visual image conjured up.
Yeah.
So I first came across your work because you posted on LinkedIn about funding, particularly for the Conservation in Prisons programme. What have been the kind of recent effects on you of funding cuts? Have there been funding cuts, I suppose, is the first part of that.
Yeah, we have recently lost 30 of our grants and agreements, and that's across the board of the work we do. And we do conservation research, habitat restoration, we raise plant materials, and then ecological education. So those 30, unfortunately, have really carved a hole in our nonprofit, and we've just ended up laying a few people off, and we will likely end up laying more people off in the near future. So we're sort of in survival mode, and what it's done to the Conservation in Prisons project in particular, basically it means that the 9 prisons in which we worked prior to this will no longer have sagebrush in prisons, and butterfly labs that, we were raising endangered butterflies to release out into the wild to prevent extinction. So none of that stuff will be able to go on into the future. And the sad part is that we had signed agreements with these agencies, but that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is under the Department of Interior, and also the Bureau of Land Management. We had signed agreements with these, and in most cases, they were multi-year signed agreements, so 5-year signed agreements. And unfortunately, we were targeted by the current administration for our diversity, equity, and inclusion language, and those grants were pulled. And so we're continuing to assess the damage and trying to figure out where we're going to find funding to get these programs going. But in the meantime, I have, I would say, 12 crews now, not just 9, because in some prisons we work with multiple crews. We have about 9 crews of incarcerated individuals who will not have jobs. And that just really kills me. And part of the reason it kills me is because I am fortunate enough to get to see their writing on this work. And often they write to us and let us know how much this program means to them. It gives them a little bit of an autonomy in a life where they are incarcerated. It gives them peace of mind by being out in nature and working with something that is natural, as opposed to being surrounded by, stark concrete and barbed wire. So it just really breaks my heart knowing that they won't have access to that in at least this coming year.
The whole thing is just diabolical. I know people are going to be listening to this just open-mouthed, and it, as you say, heartbreaking is exactly the term. It's just, horrendous. I mean, can people carry on in I was going to say in a voluntary capacity, but that's always problematic in my opinion. So, that's not a solution. And to pull the rug on multi-year funding is just, it's gobsmacking. I'm shocked.
Yeah.
Can you look to alternative funders, or can you appeal any of this?
That is what we're doing. The word right now is that the decision is not appealable, although there is some discussion as to whether that's actually true or not. And so we're working with other nonprofits who have also been canceled because we were one of a few. We anticipate there are going to be more nonprofits get canceled in this way. And so I don't think we'll be alone in this boat, I'm sad to say. But yeah, we are working on finding additional funding. Foundations, I think, is where we are turning to currently, trying to find money, because it appears that we are not going to be successful in attracting funding from the federal government going forward. Hopefully, as this administration gets out of office and one that is more balanced comes in, we'll have an opportunity to competitively compete for more money, because these monies are competitive. They're not just given to us. We have to compete for it. And I guess the other part of me as a U.S. taxpayer is heartbroken, is because, this effort represents a many $million investment by the U.S. government toward the health and well-being of not only sagebrush steppe habitat, but also helping people who don't have access to nature have an easy access to understanding nature. And the thing that we know of programs like this is that they prevent people from committing crimes in the future. So they're super beneficial to people who've been incarcerated, not just in the standpoint of giving them a job while they're in prison, but also from the standpoint of creating a whole and more balanced and crime-free life. And I think that's an investment worthy of itself.
Well, again, that's an example of the short-sightedness of this, because people will cost more money if they go back into the criminal system further down the line. Because I work with people and I know the difference that being out in nature can make to people. And yes, of course, it's about the conservation, but it's also about the people. And that's immeasurable and so important and, devastating cuts, really.
Yeah.
So is these funding cuts being made countrywide, or is it just in your area?
Oh, no, they definitely are being made countrywide. And I think right now Congress is in shutdown mode they're trying to pass a budget and they're arguing with each other. And so the government is not functioning right now. And in the meantime, we have one of the government agents that's on this administration side is cutting positions. So that's the other thing that we have had to contend with, is that many of the people that we have worked with in the past, their jobs have been cut. And so us trying to even get information on some of our funding resources has been absolute nightmare. Our normal pathways for accessing the US system, for finding out about our money, for getting reimbursed for the work that we have already done has been compromised by, this wholesale firing of federal employees. So it's heartbreaking in so many facets. We just can't move fast enough through this administration, in my opinion.
I suspect that a lot of people listening will agree with you from across the pond. I have to say, it's no consolation, but to be honest with you, even our Labour government, who we all pinned our hopes on, have really not done very much, and in fact done a lot of stuff that's very detrimental. So it seems to be a global malaise with politicians, and the fact that money talks always. Kind of bringing it back to the people that are affected, it's really, really sad, and I'm so heartbroken for you and for everybody involved. Is there anything that we can do as listeners, or any words of encouragement you can offer to people, or ways forward? Is there anything we can salvage from this?
Well, I think in a shameless bid, if you're so interested and you have the spare money to do so, of course, we would love donations. And you can find that at our website easy enough. But in a bigger and a wider world, I would say maybe the biggest thing that you can do is learn about nature and know the nature where you live, because that is the first step toward preventing harm to it. You have to know what's there so that your actions don't negatively disturb the habitat that you live in and that you depend on. That is not recognized, I think, very widely. And yet it turns out to be the core reason why we are having to do all of this restoration work, right? Is people acting on the landscape in ways that are harmful to it.
Thank you very much to Karen for sharing the story of her work, and thanks to you for listening. I know this episode was a bit off-piste, but I'm keen to highlight the negative effects our governments are having on both domestic and large-scale habitats and green spaces across the globe, if for no other reason than to bring awareness to the injustices happening. If you like this episode, you might also like episode 333, Designing for Habitat and Biodiversity, and episode 247, Botanical Education. rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.